son of Ahasuerus, by descent a Mede, who was made king over the realm of the Chaldeans. In the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, perceived in the books the number of years that according to the word of the Lord to Jeremiah the prophet must pass before the end of the desolations of Jerusalem, namely 70 years. All right. So Daniel prays in the first year of Darius the Mede during the exile in Babylon. Now, this tells us some things chronologically. I've mentioned this before. If we're given date markers, there's a reason for it. There are plenty of passages of Scripture that we're given no date markers for. So when we are given date markers like this, it's worth paying attention. Chronologically, Daniel 8 and 9 appear to be separated by about 4 to 5 years. Now, I say about, and I give a range because it's nearly impossible to be exactly certain, or at least it's impossible for me to. But in Daniel 8, the vision occurs in the third year of King Belshazzar. That's according to chapter 8 and verse 1. Daniel prays in the first year of Darius the Mede. Historically, Babylon fell to the Medes and the Persians in 539 BC. That ended Belshazzar's reign. So Belshazzar had the reign until the Medes and the Persians took over. Darius the Mede's first year would therefore immediately follow the conquest. And so that gives us a key, number one. This is immediately after the Babylonians have fallen. And in the first year of the Persian reign. But the gap between the events that are in Belshazzar's third year to the first year of Darius is 4 to 5 years, assuming that we understand Belshazzar's range properly. He's believed to have reigned about 6 years from 543 to 539. If that's right, then you've got 4 to 5 years here that's taken place. What's interesting to me in this, though, more than that date marker, is what's said in verse 2. In the first year of his reign. By the way, when it says the first year of his reign, that doesn't necessarily mean the first day he began to reign. That means sometime during that year. I, Daniel, perceived in the books the number of years that, according to the word of the Lord to Jeremiah the prophet, must pass before the end of the desolation of Jerusalem. What is that saying? Okay. Yeah. Pretty impressive if he didn't have access. I think it clearly is suggesting that he had access because it says that I perceived in the books. But what does that mean? If he perceived something, what does that mean? Okay, he saw it. He understood it. He came to realize. If he perceived something in the books, what does that mean? He was studying, which is a step beyond reading. He's not just reading. Now he's actually taking what is read, not just understanding the words, but asking the question of what? What does it mean and how does it apply? Absolutely. And there's reasons for that, by the way. Let's think about even what we've read in this very book. What happened to, for instance, Nebuchadnezzar's attitude toward the God of the Hebrews? Okay, Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar came to respect Jehovah. What about Nebuchadnezzar's son or grandson who ruled after him? He came to respect him even a little more after his interaction with Daniel and what happened. And so there's not a lack of respect for God. There's a growth of respect for God by their interaction with the people of God, particularly with Daniel and his three friends. I'm sure there were others that exemplified godliness and faith as well. But those four are featured in the first half of this book, and they are directly connected to the rulers of these empires going, okay, we don't want to make that God mad at us, and we do want him to befriend us. Again, even though they're not giving up their polytheism or their idolatry, they are saying, okay, this God is real, and we want favor from him, not anger. That is directly tied to the way that Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego lived their lives before them. How they interacted with them, how they treated them, how they spoke to them, the respect that they showed them, and the absolute resolve when it came to matters of God that they would not compromise. They're compromising with everything else. But when it comes to matters of God and religion, no compromise. Even the enemies of Daniel came to realize that, remember? When they tried to find some reason to turn Nebuchadnezzar against Daniel, they couldn't find it. They said to themselves, what? The only hope we have is in the matter of his faith and in his dealings with his God. He's uncompromising when it comes to that. He's not going to change. We can get him there. But that also tells us just how consistent Daniel was when it came to religious things. Because not only did they know he was not willing to compromise, they knew what he would do. And how did they know what he would do? Because he had so consistently done it before. That tells us about the effect of our living in the world about us. It may be entirely possible that the reason why the impact of the gospel is as compromised as it is because we are not openly living the resolve that Daniel lived. And listen, Daniel had the same concerns that we did. Daniel, in fact, had an argument for it to be a whole lot more severe. He was in a position where if he angered his adversaries, what would happen? He'd definitely lose his favor, which he was enjoying. But there's the end of that, and everything in the spectrum in the middle, by the way, is included, is he would lose his life, which the story brings us to a point where he was confronted with that, right? With forfeiting his life. He had everything to lose. He had the exact same motivations that we have today to say, I'm just going to be quiet. I'm going to keep to myself. I'm not going to say anything that's going to make people mad. That he wasn't worried about that. And did it make people mad? Yes, but did that turn out for his betterment or for his detriment? Eventually to his betterment. Now here's the question. Am I going to live with that same conviction? And trust that if I live with that conviction, that even though it may incur anger and people may lash out at me, in the end, it will serve to my betterment, not to my detriment, because that's how they lived. And when they did that, when they lived very publicly like that, even people who were not those that fear God came to have fear for God. If we want the gospel and the church to have the kind of respect, even from the people in the world, that it should have, it's only going to come when we boldly live godly lives. That's part of the lesson here. But anyway, back to specifically what's going on in verse 2. He is reading the scriptures, studying the scriptures, and saying, I'm going to build my life based on what I'm reading here. I'm going to make decisions based on what I'm reading here. I'm going to trust what the scriptures say. Let's go to Jeremiah 25 and verse 11. We're told specifically that Jeremiah's prophecy is under consideration with Daniel. I think the idea is that it's broader than that. Because if you read through it, it says, I perceived in the books, not in the book, but in the books. And then he says, according to the word of the Lord to Jeremiah the prophet, certain things must happen, and there's a certain time frame that I perceived. So at least part of what he's talking about comes from the book of Jeremiah. And verses 11 and 12 of chapter 25 say, this whole land shall become a ruin and a waste. By the way, this whole land is talking about Israel. This whole land shall become a ruin and a waste, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. Then after 70 years are completed, I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation, the land of the Chaldeans, for their iniquity, declares the Lord, making the land an everlasting waste. And so Daniel reads this and says, wait a minute, this is describing what I'm living through. And it just put a date frame on this. There's going to be 70 years, and then the Chaldeans are going to be destroyed. And so from that, he begins to build a belief. Let's go to chapter 29 and verse 10 of Jeremiah. For thus says the Lord, when 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will visit you, and I will fulfill to you my promise and bring you back to this place. So he didn't just say that in 70 years Babylon's going to be judged, but he also says when that 70 years is completed, I will visit you. And I will fulfill my promise to you. What was the promise of God? To give them a land. And to make a great nation out of them. Into which the whole world would be blessed. And that he wasn't going to leave them or allow them to be destroyed, because then what would happen? If Babylon had gone in and just completely annihilated Israel, committed genocide, killed them all, what would have happened? There's no Messiah. Not one that's a descendant of Israel, because all of his descendants have been executed. Now, if we want to have the faith of Abraham, then we could say what? He could raise one of them up from the dead and make it happen. But there's always that lingering promise. They should have always known that whatever happened to them, it was not going to be so catastrophic that they would cease to exist, because there was that lingering promise that had not been fulfilled. And he's saying that I will fulfill my promise. I will bring you back to this place. Yes, sir. Right. Right. He's going to step in. And I mean, the story with Jesus is powerful as well, because he sends them to Egypt, and then they come back after a time, and there's that old prophecy that I will bring my deliverer out of Egypt. And how's that going to, is it going to be an Egyptian? No, it was someone of the tribe of Judah who was delivered out of Egypt back to the promised land to become the Messiah. So I mean, that's very powerful. But even more so, as far as storytelling goes, is this Moses story, where Moses is put into a basket as an infant on the river and just floated down the Nile. And it comes to rest in some reeds, and it happens to be who that's there cleaning up? The daughter of Pharaoh. And instead of going, hey, it's one of those Hebrew kids, they're clearly trying to hide, Dad wants them dead, and upsetting the basket and killing the child, she picks him up and brings him home and convinces Pharaoh to let her do what? To raise. Now, Pharaoh's the one that gave the order, kill them all. And yet this one, he says, okay, you can raise it. And then the irony gets even thicker, because who ends up actually raising Moses? His very own mother, who then teaches him the knowledge of the Hebrews, about the God of the Hebrews, the history of the Hebrews. And we know that all that was taught to him, and we'll talk about, well, let's just go ahead and talk about why we know it, and hopefully I won't forget the other point I want to make. Because when he was 40 years old and he saw an Egyptian attacking a Hebrew, he said, what? These are my people, and I'm going to protect my people. He related to them. He knew he was Hebrew. He knew that connection. How long did his mother have him? This is an important point. Till she weaned him. How old are children when they get weaned? It does depend on the kid a little bit. In between one. So she had this child less than 2 years. This child was less than, or let's just be generous. Let's be generous and round to 3. Let's say she kept him 3. I don't think she kept him 3 years, but let's say she kept him 3 years. That means all of this knowledge that he retained and held and went all the way until he was 40 and then acted on was taught to him before he was 3 years old. You don't think it's important to teach your children? You don't think what you teach them in the first few years of their life shapes who they are? That's where he got, guess what teaching he got after he was weaned? How to be an Egyptian. But when he was 40, what he remembered was that he was a Hebrew. That's how important it is to teach your children. And it's not something that waits. When do we start educating children in this country? From a legal standpoint, 5. Nope, not 4. They won't let you start when you're 4. Don't matter how close. Yeah, but that you're not required. You're not required. It's not compulsory. 5 years old is compulsory. And if you're not going to let the state educate them, what do you have to do from that point? You have to document that you're doing it and document that it's being done, and they have to be tested to be sure that it's being done. So that is all compulsory. The state says at 5 years old, kids need to be educated. And guess what? That is when education starts for most children. I know that. I know that personally. I have dealt with 5-year-old kids that don't know their alphabet, that don't know how to count, that don't know anything about anything. When I got a 2-year-old granddaughter that already knows her alphabet and can count. And I had a 3-year-old son that could read. The difference is what they're taught when they're little. And when it comes to spiritual learning, that is no different. And if you don't teach them anything at home, guess what's going to happen? Their understanding of God and the Bible is going to be formed what they hear from the world. And it will not be good, most likely. We have to keep that. We see that being played out in that Moses story. God is engaged. He is not. And by the way, I've been getting taught this since I was 5 years old. This deistic idea of God being a watchmaker who created things in his hands off and just letting it play out however it plays out. That is glorified. That view is glorified by the few people who still teach about God in the world. Most people don't teach about God in the world anymore, but the few that still teach about God in the world say, hey, the smartest people that we know, the people who founded this nation, they were deists, and they believed that God was like a watchmaker, and he just set things together and then is hands off at this point. Daniel is directly saying, I am not hands off. I'm very much involved. Now, why do people get to the view that God must be hands off? Exactly. Why does evil happen? And I'll even go further than that. I think free will does certainly come into play, but I think it's even more than that. I think evil has to happen. It's actually mandatory. So what we see is that we shouldn't doubt God because of what we see in the world. We should realize what God is doing because we read and study and see these things and go, this is exactly what he said, which is what Daniel did, right? Daniel read the scriptures, he read Jeremiah, he perceived that Jeremiah was talking about the very things that he saw going on in the world. And so it says very clearly here that he perceived in the books the number of years that according to the word of the Lord, Jeremiah the prophet must pass before the end of the desolations of Jerusalem, namely 70 years. A day is coming when we will not be in bondage here anymore. And that day is 70 years. And guess what? Daniel's getting old. And so what does he know is happening? It's close to the time. And the Babylonians have been deposed. Now, but I want you to notice very carefully the way verse 1 is worded in connection with that. The first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus, a descendant of Mede, who was made king over the realm of the Chaldeans. So the Medes and the Persians were now in power, but it's still the same empire. It's still the Chaldean Empire. The Chaldean Empire is not synonymous with Babylon anymore. The Chaldean Empire is now synonymous with the Medes and the Persians. But it's still the same Chaldean Empire. And that is what he says here. Let's go back to 25 for a minute. Well, let me look at 2 Chronicles 36 first. And I'll just reference that back in Jeremiah 25, it specifies Chaldeans, not Babylon. All right. 2 Chronicles 36, verses 20 and 21. Listen to what this says. He took into exile in Babylon those who had escaped from the sword, and they became servants to him and to his sons until the establishment of the kingdom of Persia, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed its Sabbaths. All the days that it lay desolate, it kept Sabbath to fulfill 70 years. So the Chronicle writer formally records that that's what took place. That those events that are talked about by the prophet Daniel and that history talks about, that was what Jeremiah was talking about. And that is what came to pass. After Darius, by the way, or Darius, depending on which way you want to pronounce it, both I think are legitimate, who eventually is the king that rises up over this empire? Anybody remember? A guy named Cyrus. He's the guy that's invented. What did Cyrus do? He sent them back to Jerusalem. Didn't just send them back to Jerusalem, but sent soldiers to protect them on the way and gave them the stuff that they needed to rebuild Jerusalem. He became a friend and a helper to the people of Israel to bring them back and bring them safely back. And that's the story of Nehemiah, Ezra and Nehemiah. And so we got to stop. The clock says I have to stop. This is really rich stuff. And it means a lot for us about how we should read, why it's so important for us to study. What might we learn if we actually read what's here and think about it and start trying to figure out how to apply it to our lives? How will that transform our confidence? How will that transform our behavior going forward? And what we see in the person of Daniel and how he is doing this, we see the value of that. Thanks for your presence and participation.
I have heard of a land on a faraway strand. In the Bible the story is told, where cares never come, never darkness nor gloom, and nothing shall ever grow old. In that beautiful land on the faraway strand, no storms with their blast ever frown. The street, I am told, is paved with pure gold, and the sun